Thanks for the introduction, Denise. Denise mentioned my book, Carbon Criminals, Climate Crimes, published in 2020. And when I got done working on that book, I wasn't sure what I would do next. But when COVID hit and we kind of were locked down for a while, I decided to go back and pick up an issue that I had addressed earlier in my career. Back in the 1980s, I had actually written about the sociology of nuclear weapons. And of course, those of you that remember that era, when Ronald Reagan became president, there was a lot of hysteria that was whipped up, a lot of war fervor, and it led to a gigantic rally in New York City on June 12, 1982. 1 million people, really 1 million people showed up in downtown New York to march up to Central Park. And there were lots of activities that went on that issue. And at that time, I decided that I needed to investigate that as a sociologist. So that kind of launched me into focusing on this issue. And eventually, of course, then I brought my criminological perspective into it as well, looking at nuclear weapons and international law. So I'd written a number of things about this over the years, and then I'd kind of gotten away from it. But when COVID hit, I decided, well, I should probably do something while I'm sitting around here in the house all this time. So I decided I would try to pull all that stuff together in a new book. And this is the new book, Apocalyptic Crimes, Why Nuclear Weapons Are Illegal and Must Be Abolished. I have to credit my good friend Ray Michalowski for the subtitle of the book. So I just signed a contract for this book. It's not out yet. I've been using my sabbatical to finish the book, and I'm working on the last chapter right now. This is actually just a mock-up of what the cover might look like. My daughter, who's a very talented young lady, editor and writer, she designed the cover for Carbon Criminals, and she's also been giving me suggestions for covers for this book as well. Well, one of the things that I thought I needed to do in the last chapter of this book is to come back and look at the issue of the climate crisis and nuclear weapons and look at the nexus between them. And there definitely is a nexus. These are the two key existential dangers that we face, right? There is an important connection or nexus between them. As Denise mentioned, it's often ignored. These twin threats do have much in common, however, and I've tried to sort of tease out some of the commonalities there and some of the connections between the two. Jonathan Schell, who was the great abolitionist, one of the greatest writers on this issue, one of the greatest nuclear abolitionists of our time, I think really got at the issue here in terms of the swollen human power that's invested in these critical institutions, the war system, and of course the fossil fuel industry. And both of these institutional structures, these historical social structures, contribute to the apocalyptic nature of the threat that we face, and they have to be addressed. Anyone concerned with one should be concerned with the other. Schell said that way back in 2007. Each is a blameworthy harm. In my book on Carbon Criminals, I try to tease out a definition of crime. Crime is a blameworthy harm, an intentional action to create harm that's committed without excuse or justification. Sometimes those blameworthy harms are condemned by the public, not all the time, but sometimes, and often there's some kind of legal definition and response. But even if you don't have the public condemnation and the legal definition, there are some criminologists that argue that we as criminologists have a responsibility to point out these blameworthy harms and bring them to the attention of the public and legal authorities. And in my book, Carbon Criminals, I think I documented that, again, the blameworthy harms associated with the climate crisis have increasingly come to be condemned by larger publics, and there's a huge amount of climate change litigation. Denise and I both try to keep track of that, and there's so much of it going on that we can't really keep track of it. So on all those scores, the climate crisis does qualify as a form of crime. Now, with regard to nuclear weapons, it's a little easier because we have an immense body of international law that has been developed over time. So the harmful practices associated with the use or threat to use or continued possession of nuclear weapons has been dealt with by international law. And there are legal regimes that try to deal with both of these problems. And I want to try to spend a little bit of time toward the end talking about those legal regimes and the problems and obstacles that they encounter. So the two threats, the climate crisis and nuclear weapons, are interrelated in a number of different ways. So I'm going to tick off 7 different ways that I think that we can see a connection between the two. One, of course, is that climate disruptions that are currently occurring could spiral into a nuclear war, could spiral into an exchange of nuclear weapons. Again, often, so criminologists have been focusing a lot on how the climate crisis and climate disruptions increase the capacity for violence in society in all kinds of ways. And so there's a lot of documentation about how global warming has led to increased conflict and violence. But often those people don't take it to the next. Could that go to the highest level? Could that go all the way up to nuclear warfare? Michael Clare, some of you may recognize that name, that analyst, has been one who has said, yes, this is a possibility. We need to consider this. That because of what he calls resource wars, and in particular over water. I mean, he wrote a book on resource wars back in the 90s. And if he was rewriting it today, he would probably most centrally focus on water as the resource that's most likely to lead to various kinds of conflicts and wars. The climate crisis also increasingly is leading to failed states, the decay of nation states, and increasingly leads to a certain level of armed violence over these scarce resources, and that could, again, easily spiral off into a nuclear war. The situation that's often mentioned in this regard is the situation between Pakistan and India. Here we have 2 nuclear armed states, right? And they are long-standing enemies. The Indus River is a transboundary water system, as you know, and comes off the Himalayas. It goes down into Pakistan. By treaty, India is allowed to draw some water off of the river, but what if India decided, hey, we don't want to just take the water that's allowed under the treaty. What if we want to take all of it? What if we want to not allow that water to make its way down to Pakistan? And one can easily imagine, and again, these countries have almost gone to war a number of different times in the last 20 to 30 years. So again, this is a scary situation when these 2 nations possess nuclear weapons and such a critical resource could lead them into conflict. So that's one of the connections here. Again, this is not one that's probably obvious to a lot of people or that a lot of people think about, but there certainly is a potentiality there. And as the conflicts associated with climate disruptions increase over time, again, the chance that those conflicts could careen out of control is certainly a possibility. The second issue that I want to talk about is that the actual use of nuclear weapons then could cause catastrophic climatic effects, such as the onset of nuclear winter. Now again, if some of you are old enough, you remember back in the 1980s, Dr. Carl Sagan, the famed astronomer who had a wonderful program on PBS called Cosmos. And it was just a delightful program, and Sagan was instructing us about the billions and billions and billions of stars that are out there. But Sagan and a group of scholars also were investigating the climatic effects of nuclear warfare, and they concluded that if even a limited nuclear exchange occurred, that what could happen is that the dust and the smoke and the debris generated from the blast could throw up into the atmosphere all of this stuff that would block the sun and would lead to, again, to drastic cold spell for the earth, which would threaten agricultural production. And again, this idea of nuclear winter took effect, and it was a big and very controversial back in the 80s. The Reagan administration hated it, and as I'll document in just a moment, they definitely tried to fight back and engage in denial of the concept of nuclear winter at that time, because it certainly undercut their nuclear arms buildup. It undercut their idea that a nuclear war could be survivable, could be winnable. And they were actually some people arguing that in the early 1980s. But the concept of nuclear winter is still around, And I think still the science would still say that, yeah, even if Pakistan and India would engage in some kind of a nuclear exchange, it would still throw up enough debris and dust and smoke into the atmosphere that it would cause a considerable cooling. So isn't it interesting that, with global warming, we're concerned that the Earth is getting too hot, but if a nuclear war would occur, the opposite effect would occur, the cooling of the Earth, but both would have dramatic climatic effects. Both would be disastrous for the human prospect. As I mentioned, during the Reagan administration, they were not happy with Dr. Sagan and those who were promoting the concept of nuclear winter, and they began to engage in what I call socially organized denial. Now, certainly we know very much about the socially organized denial that's related to climate change, but the socially organized denial related to nuclear winter was sort of a precursor to that. In fact, some of the very same people who participated in the denial of the concept of nuclear winter would stick around and contribute mightily to the socially organized denial related to the climate crisis as well. So in both instances, you had people who, for ideological reasons, were rejecting the science. They didn't want to accept the science because the conclusions of the science, of the impact science as we might call it, was detrimental to their ideological and political agenda. And so they fought back against it and tried to deny it, tried to undercut it, tried to basically assert that Dr. Sagan and his comrades didn't know what they were talking about and that their science was faulty, and some of the same arguments that we know occurred with regard to the climate crisis. I devote a considerable amount of time in Carbon Criminals to looking at the socially organized denial that was related to the climate crisis. And again, often this operated through conservative think tanks that were the Heartland Institute, for example. And these were funded often by corporations in the fossil fuel industry, and conservative foundations would contribute, and they would set up these think tanks, and they would recruit scholars, and they would put out reports and try to generate data that there was an attempt to counter the evidence that was being accumulated by the IPCC and climate scientists like Dr. Hansen, to try to undercut or deny, or at least raise doubt, right? Doubt is our product. And that phrase goes back to the tobacco industry attempting to undercut the impact science about the impact of tobacco. And they said, look, doubt is our product. If we can just create enough doubt, that will gum up the political works. The political system won't be able to do anything about tobacco if we create enough doubt about whether this is really a connection there. And the same thing with regard to nuclear winter, the same thing with regard to carbon emissions leading to global warming. So again, we have socially organized denial occurring with both of them, and again related because some of the same people participating in the denial of nuclear winter also engaged in denial of the climate crisis. Now I'm going to have to get a little criminological here with you for a moment. Number 4 is that both of these apocalyptic crimes involve what Ray Michalowski and I call state-facilitated corporate wrongdoing. So Ray and I look at state corporate crime. Denise mentioned our book with that title, Wrongdoing at the Intersection of Business and Government. And there's a couple different forms of state corporate crime. Sometimes there's state-initiated corporate crime. So, for example, when NASA, the space agency, let a contract for the space shuttle, and the company Morton Thiokol that built the solid rocket booster for the space shuttle produced a faulty product, and it led, of course, to the explosion of the space shuttle Challenger, killing the 7 astronauts on board. That was a state-initiated project, right? It was the state that let the contract, and it was the state that basically allowed for the defect to stay and not be dealt with. But there's also state-facilitated, in which the corporation takes the lead. The corporation's engaged in some kind of production process and is producing some kind of harm. And the government has the ability to step in and regulate or stop or deal with it, but it chooses not to, or it allows the corporate harm to continue. So this is state-facilitated corporate crime. And I think both the climate crisis and nuclear weapons involve state-facilitated corporate wrongdoing, whether it's in the weapons industry, which is producing the bombs, the delivery vehicles, and of course there's massive fraud and cost overruns and all kinds of other criminality that goes on with regard to the defense industry. Billions of dollars are wasted every year. Our defense budget is, so the actual figure that you'll get from the Biden administration right now is that we're like $830 some billion, but actually it's about 1.5 trillion. If you count all the defense-related spending or war-related spending, it's about $1.5 trillion every year, 1.5 trillion dollars. And much of that is absolutely wasted. And a lot of it goes to the war industry. Sorensen, what's the guy's name, Daniel? We had him on with KNOW. Sorensen's all I can remember his last name. Anyway, he's written a wonderful book called The War Industry, in which he thoroughly documents all the problems with the defense industry. And again, the government facilitates this. It allows for these crimes to occur. The military-industrial complex is a real thing, right? It is a real thing, and it's a set of interlocking interests that continue to promote a very extensive defense budget or war budget, and allows for all kinds of corporate crimes to occur within the defense industry. Now we see the same thing in the fossil fuel industry, of course. The fossil fuel industry engages through ecological extractions, digging up all that carbon and then marketing it and causing it to be burned, leading to ecological additions, pollution. And again, this is not very well regulated by our government, is it? Over time, the fossil fuel industry has amassed an enormous amount of power, and it's able to shield itself from critical regulations that might cause it to do something different. And so we have state-facilitated corporate wrongdoing going on in both the war industry as well as in the fossil fuel industry. Each of these crimes is also characterized by what I call political omission or state negligence. In other words, the harms are clear. We know that the harms are occurring. Government could step in and do something. Government has a responsibility, a legal and moral obligation in most cases, to do something, to reduce carbon emissions, to help the world adapt to climate disruptions that are already occurring or that are built in. And yet often the government refuses to act, fails to act. And Denise mentions the 40-year history of the United States government not acting to deal with the climate crisis. A bunch of kids in California and the West Coast had to sue the federal government to say, you're not doing your job, right? Our future is being jeopardized because you, as government officials and government agencies, are not doing what you should be doing. You should be protecting our future. You should be reducing carbon emissions. You should be lowering global warming. You should be doing something about the climate crisis, and you're not doing it. And on top of that, you're also facilitating an energy system that contributes to the problem, right? And so there's political omission, a failure to act. The same thing with regard to nuclear weapons. Now, we've known of the power of nuclear weapons ever since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we know that we should have done something to eliminate nuclear weapons. There was some effort. So the current book is kind of looking at another 40-year period, the same 40-year period basically, in which government failed to do anything about the nuclear question. There were many efforts that were made worldwide to try to gain some kind of control over nuclear weapons. And there's even a treaty that was signed in 1968, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in which the bargain was that, okay, the nuclear powers said, all right, rest of the world, you should not try to acquire nuclear weapons. Don't do it. We're going to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And if you agree to do that, then we, the nuclear powers, will make moves to disarm. We promise. Scout's honor, we will disarm. Well, of course, The rest of the world pretty much kept their bargain, with a few exceptions. Now, since then, of course, India and Pakistan, as we mentioned, have joined the nuclear club. So did Israel. And North Korea, which initially signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty and then later withdrew and has also now produced nuclear weapons. So the nuclear club is now 9. The initial 5 nuclear powers, the 5 powers that are the Security Council, have the veto power in the Security Council, the permanent members, and these other 4. But the rest of the world pretty much kept their end of the bargain, but the nuclear powers did not. The nuclear club has not made any effort. In fact, just the opposite. At this moment, most of the major nuclear powers are engaged in what are called modernization projects, modernization and expansion of their nuclear arsenals, the exact opposite of what they promised to do in 1968. They said they would disarm starting in 1968, and they haven't done so. So again, we have political omission, state negligence here with regard to the harms that have been created by the possession and threat to use nuclear weapons and by climate disruptions. I would also argue that both are crimes of empire. That is, the harms are basically related to imperial geopolitical actions by these powerful states. With regard to the climate crisis, it often was wars to secure access to and control over oil in the Middle East. We're at the 20-year anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. While that was not the only motivating factor in that war, certainly access to and control over oil was a central feature. And of course, the United States has a long history going back to the end of World War II, to the Carter Doctrine, to saying that that's our oil over there in the Middle East, and we're going to do everything we need to do to protect it, including the use of military force. And of course, we have used military force on a number of different occasions, and starting with the 1991, the first Gulf War, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And so these are the wars for the greater Middle East, as historian Andrew Bacevich terms them. They're certainly related to the pursuit of empire, the pursuit of military domination, the control over resources, and I think we can analyze them that way. With regard to nuclear weapons, here it's a little more controversial, but there's a lot of literature on empire and the bomb. And this goes right back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because there's the strong argument that's been made and evidence presented by historians like Gar Alperovitz and John Dower and Martin Sherwin that part of the reason why the United States decided to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was to intimidate the Soviet Union, right? The Cold War was starting before the Hot War had ended, right? We already knew that Stalin and the Soviet Union were going to be our rival in the post-World War II era. And we were trying to intimidate Stalin. There was a lot of consideration that if we use the bomb, it'll send a message to Joe, right? He'll get the message that not to mess around with the United States. Plus, if we end the war quickly, it also means that the Soviets won't be able to participate in the Far Eastern campaigns. And we were very concerned that they were going to try to grab up huge portions of East Asia and maybe participate in the invasion of the Japanese islands. And we didn't want to share that area with them. So for geopolitical reasons, this is what Alperovitz calls atomic diplomacy. Now again, it's not the only reason, and this is enormously controversial. The questions about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if you look at the literature, my God, controversy all over the place about what were the factors that led to the decision to drop the bomb. But it's very clear that there's a strand of historical thinking backed up by a considerable amount of empirical research that points to atomic diplomacy, considerations of intimidating the Soviet Union and ending the war quickly to block the Soviet advances in East Asia that are part of that. And Gershon points out with Empire and the Bomb that since then we have threatened to use nuclear weapons on at least 30 different occasions in various potential conflict situations in order to advance American geopolitical goals. And Daniel Ellsberg, whom we just found out has terminal cancer, one of the greatest American heroes in my estimation, But Daniel Ellsberg, in his book, The Doomsday Machine, also documents all the times in which the United States government has threatened to use nuclear weapons to get its way in various conflict situations. Again, to advance imperial goals, advance imperial objectives. So we can see that both of these are crimes of empire in a very considerable extent, to a considerable extent. All right, final point I want to make, and I want to spend a little bit of time here. Both of these have to be dealt with by the international political community, right? There's no way we can deal with the climate crisis, no way we can deal with the threat of nuclear weapons unless the international political community acts. Both of these threats have to be addressed through international law, through international agreements crafted by the United Nations and other international bodies. I like to quote Noam Chomsky here. It's internationalism or extinction. Internationalism, we get our act together, or it's extinction. We have no hope of dealing with these apocalyptic threats unless we can succeed in developing international agreements that have substance and can be enforced. And so we have to think about how we address this particular issue. Now, both have been addressed at the international level, right? We could spend a lot of time talking about both of them. There are what the international lawyers call treaty regimes, right, that deal with both of these. Treaty regimes, again, aimed at the implementation of general obligations, setting a framework for action that's contained in these international legal agreements. So, for example, on climate change, we have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It goes back to 1992. And given that framework, and again, people recognized that the climate change was a real thing, it was happening, we needed to deal with it. The IPCC that Denise mentioned was created in 1988. By 1992, we had enough evidence that, hey, we need to do something internationally about this. We created the IPCC, and we created the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and this is the body that sets up the conference of parties that occur every year. You might hear about them every November and December. That, what are we, COP27 now? Is that the last one we just had? 27 was in Egypt. And these conference of parties are supposed to put together some kind of an agreement to limit carbon emissions, to adapt to climate disruptions that are already occurring, and so forth. We've had a couple of breakthroughs. The Kyoto Protocol in 1997 was one breakthrough. In 2009, we kind of put together an agreement in Copenhagen when Barack Obama's first year, although people were very disappointed we didn't have a much stronger treaty in 2009. In fact, one of the commentators on the 2009 Conference of Parties basically said, Copenhagen is a crime scene tonight. It's a crime scene. The guilty parties are fleeing to the airport. They didn't do their job. They didn't come up with an international agreement that has enough teeth in it to really do something about the problem. But we did patch together some notions there. But the big breakthrough came in 2015, right? The Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement, Denise, I can still remember the day after the Paris Agreement, we taped a critical issues show. And we were kind of all over the map as to what we thought about it, right? Some of us thought it was great. Some of us were very skeptical. But nonetheless, it was a major advance. It was the first time that we really got most of the world together to say we're going to do something about this problem. It wasn't enough. It wasn't all that we needed, but it was certainly an important start. And so since then, the Conference of Parties have been trying to, how can we best implement and do something to make the Paris Agreement a reality. And of course, we're going to need something much stronger, right? Paris is not good enough. We need something much stronger, something that's binding legal obligation, which Paris is not. Paris is mostly voluntary contributions from countries. We need to have something where there's a binding legal commitment to reduce emissions. So we've got the UN Framework Convention. That's the treaty regime dealing with climate change. Now, with regard to nuclear weapons, I already mentioned the Non-Proliferation Treaty from 1968. There are many others. I'll just mention one that's I think is particularly important, and that is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was passed by the United Nations General Assembly in 2017. So much of the world got together and said, all right, we're going to do something about nuclear weapons. We've been debating this for decades. and you nuclear powers aren't doing anything, we're going to come together. We're actually going to have a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons. Now, earlier I had argued in my writings that the use, threat to use, and continued possession of nuclear weapons were crimes, were state crimes. I argued that they were state crimes because, number one, the use or threat to use nuclear weapons violated what's called international humanitarian law. Okay, these are the laws of war. Seems funny, but we do have laws that regulate what you can do in war. And mostly they try to protect civilians, right, and non-combatants. And the use of nuclear weapons, it's been decided by many international bodies, clearly violates the laws of war, clearly violates international humanitarian law. But that law goes back to the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. Predates, of course, the development of nuclear weapons. But in 1996, the International Court of Justice said it still applies. It said, yes, the use of nuclear weapons would still be illegal because it violates international humanitarian law. Then, of course, we had the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in which the nuclear powers agreed that they were going to disarm if the rest of the world did not pursue nuclear weapons, which they have violated. But we've never had a law that specifically prohibited nuclear weapons until now. We now have one, the 2017 TPNW. Now, of course, we need to point out the obvious fact here, right? The giant elephant in the room. The nuclear powers did not participate. Basically, they fought this tooth and nail. They basically resisted, really fiercely resisted. None of them participated, none of them voted for it, none of them would have anything to do with it. They were kind of off in the corner, with their hands in their ears saying, nah, we can't hear what you're saying over there. But the General Assembly went ahead and did pass this law. It's now been ratified by over 50 countries. It has gone into effect. And so, it's now not legal to possess nuclear weapons, despite the fact that those 9 nuclear powers still do and will still refuse to abide by the treaty, have not signed it, won't abide by it, reject it, but nonetheless, it is a law on the books, an international law. Now, this treaty, I think, is very important because it does express, there's a broad consensus within the international political community, within at least the General Assembly, that this is an important thing, and so we need to pursue this. Now, by the way, the Lawyers' Committee on Nuclear Policy is a great organization that analyzes these issues, these laws, and they made an additional point about the TPNW, that it provides a kind of linkage, visible linkage between disarmament and climate and environmental protections. I wanted to get that in there to show, again, there's a connection here through this particular law. But both the legal regimes I've been talking about face daunting challenges. That's the language of the Lawyers' Committee. I think you could probably come up with something a bit stronger than that, but daunting challenges, we'll say, is what these face. Now, there are several different levels to the constraints here that they face. One is what Richard Falk calls the structural dualism of the state system. The state system is ill-equipped, he says, to produce political responses. What we have, he said, is on the one hand, we have a juridical system, all right? A juridical system, which is basically a vertical system, equality before the law. This is best exemplified by the General Assembly, producing the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, exemplified by the World Court, the International Court of Justice. So this is the juridical system. All countries are equal. It's a vertical system, and the problem is that this vertical system, this juridical system, lacks the power to enforce its decisions and its rulings. Because we also have what Falk calls the geopolitical system. The geopolitical system is a vertical system of inequality and power relations. So again, you've got the horizontal system and the vertical system. The horizontal system is the juridical system. The vertical system is the geopolitical system. Here's where those nuclear powers come in. Here's where the great powers contend with each other, and of course block the juridical system from taking any kind of action. On top of that, let's say what we have here is the General Assembly of the United Nations exemplifying the judicial system and the Security Council representing the geopolitical system. Because remember, the Security Council has those 5 permanent members who all have the veto power, right? The 5 most powerful countries in the world, they all have nuclear weapons. They're the winners of World War II. They set up the UN. There are 10 other members of the Security Council that rotate in and out, but these are the 5 permanent members. Only the permanent members have the veto power. The other members don't. So anything they don't want discussed gets vetoed, right? Gets stopped. It's a very undemocratic institution, and yet the Security Council was set up by the UN Charter to be the mechanism of enforcement for decisions made at the United Nations. So we have a very undemocratic UN system. We have a world order system, as Falk analyzed it, where they have this structural dualism, and it makes it almost impossible for us to do anything that we need to do. So somehow that system needs to be changed. That we need to democratize the UN system. We need to produce structural change in that world order. And again, that's an extremely difficult task. It's a tall order. I have no idea how we exactly do that, but that's where we're stuck. That's where we're stuck right now. Now, on top of that, we've got neoliberal global capitalism, right, which resists structural change also, and other efforts to achieve economic and environmental justice. The whole notion of neoliberalism is that the market should be freed, right? The market should be unconstrained. States should not interfere with or regulate market decisions. The market's always right. The market's always working magic. And so we have to step back and let the capitalist system, the market system, the corporations that run the market system run wild and do whatever they do, because that will produce the best results in the long run. Well, that's a bunch of hooey, as we know, right? That doesn't work that way. But nonetheless, neoliberalism has taken a very strong hold across the world system as well. So both in terms of the geopolitical system and as well as the economic system, we are confronted with structural constraints that make it difficult for us to act, make it difficult for us to do anything to reduce carbon emissions, make it difficult for us to actually advance the project of disarmament. And so that's where we're stuck right now. And again, that's the problem that we face. Now, is there a way out of this? I don't know. I have to be honest, I have no idea. But there are a number of people, Michael Clare, one of them, Richard Falk, Noam Chomsky. Chomsky says education and organization, right? You got to educate people, you got to organize people, you got to create political movements. Turning back the doomsday clock, which is, as Denise said, is now set at 90 seconds to midnight, will require a large-scale integrated progressive social movement that can mobilize people to resist the twin apocalyptic threats and to bring about these structural changes. And Michael Clare, the quote from Michael Clare there, I think, is telling. This is important. Only by uniting our efforts toward climate and nuclear sanity in a joint campaign for human survival will it be possible to triumph over these destructive forces. So I'll leave you with that, that conundrum, that political conundrum. Thank you. I'd be happy to entertain questions or comments from people. Daniel.
That author is Christian Sorensen.
Christian Sorensen, right,
Yep.
The War Industry.
Yep.
The War Industry, great book, really thoroughly documents what's going on at the defense industries, right.
And also KNOW is putting up a billboard. We have funding for 30 days, a billboard that's going to say abolish nuclear weapons. And we don't know the location yet, but it'd be nice if we could get some more funding to put it up for another 30 days.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
And the idea is, we'll have a website there so people will, because it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, the whole problem with nuclear weapons, it seems, at least compared with the 1980s, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's trying to get people to realize this is a problem, and people hopefully will come to the website and get active.
And I should point out, there are many, many groups out there in the world that are working on this issue. It's not like we're all by ourselves and we have to start from scratch. There are very powerful social movement organizations. ICANN, the International Committee to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 because of their great work in sponsoring the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons. ICANN is a very powerful force, and there are many others out there like ICANN. I mentioned the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, another very powerful organization. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which produces the Doomsday Clock, which they just advanced to 90 seconds in January. So there are many organizations out there, and I always think that people shouldn't feel alone and isolated. There are groups out there that you can join together with in common cause. And I think it's important for local groups like KNOW, Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War, to link up with some of these national and international organizations that are already doing great work on these issues, and to add to the force, the power of those great organizations doing this work.
Yeah. Why are nuclear weapons considered to be the worst form of weaponry? Aren't there other means of waging war?
There certainly are, and international humanitarian law, which I pointed out goes back to the 19th century, was created to try to control the worst aspects of warfare, to basically protect innocent civilians and to protect non-combatants, and to make sure that certain kinds of weapons that are indiscriminate in their effects are not used, right? And so there's been a long struggle to kind of identify what those weapons are. Clearly, when nuclear weapons come along, we now have a weapon that's far, far beyond any of the other kinds of weapons that are available in terms of its destructive impact, right? And even moving from, the fission bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima to the hydrogen bomb that came later, the fusion bomb, thermonuclear weapons, with dramatic increase in capacity for destruction there. So these are very unique weapons in that, but there are other weapons, of course, that are also deadly and could be subjected to controls based on international humanitarian law.
I guess to a lot of people, when it comes to the idea of nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament, it runs into a roadblock once you get two nations like North Korea that you brought up, and potential nuclear armed powers like Iran. When it comes to the idea of nuclear disarmament, it seems almost insane that they'd agree to that. And I guess, I don't know, what would be your opinion on how would you overcome that roadblock? As you stated, you don't have really a good end to the whole situation anyway, but I don't know if you have a good answer to that.
Well, I think that going back to the Non-Proliferation Treaty back in the 1960s, I mean, that was very successful. I mean, that was there was the ability at that time to convince most of the countries of the world not to pursue nuclear weapons, and even some that had started down that path, like South Africa, changed their mind and backed off. And that was a pretty successful treaty for a long period of time, except that the nuclear powers didn't hold up their end of the bargain, right? Most of the rest of the world did. Now, of course, there were some, like India and Pakistan, who never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel never signed it. So you had those outliers, those, we could use the term rogue state, although that was not the original meaning of the rogue state. And again, what we had then later on was an attempt to justify imperial wars based upon the threat of weapons of mass destruction, right? What was the main case against Saddam Hussein back 20 years ago, right? He's got weapons of mass destruction. Well, no, he didn't. And we knew that he didn't. Scott Ritter and others who had been part of the UN process, the disarmament process, knew that the monitoring system had been in place and that the nuclear weapons program in Iraq had been dismantled. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction, but the Bush administration told like 935 lies, that's the exact number, according to one scholar, about this. And then, of course, with regard to Iran. But now you come back to what I call the nuclear hypocrisy, right? The United States has, well, at one point there were close to 70,000 nuclear warheads in the world. But if Iran or Iraq tries to get one, Boom, they're outlaws. They're rogue states. They're nuclear outlaws. They must be dealt with through military force, right? Through military force. This was non-proliferation by military force, which is what the George W. Bush administration was arguing with regard to Saddam Hussein 20 years ago. And again, with regard to Iran. But now, if you think about it, for some of those countries, obtaining a nuclear weapon might be an important way to defend against being invaded, right? Maybe Saddam Hussein should have had a nuclear weapon and he wouldn't have been invaded, is what some people might think, right? So the Iranians might think that. The North Koreans might think that. And again, you're always going to have some of those rogue states, and you're going to have some leaders that might want to pursue that path. But it's hard. How do we condemn them morally and legally before the international community when we're sitting on thousands of nuclear weapons? We've got thousands and thousands, but you can't have one. That doesn't fly. That's not going to work in the international community, right? And so if you want to convince a North Korea that they have to give up their weapons or not pursue those weapons, then the rest of the world has to, basically fulfill their obligation, the solemn legal obligation to disarm under the NPT, which they have not done. So I think that's part of the problem. Now, the Obama administration did negotiate a deal with Iran. We did stop the Iranian effort to create a weapon. Trump came in and blew it all up. And now we're kind of back to square zero trying to deal with Iran. So yeah, it's a problem, but the nuclear hypocrisy, I think, is a big impediment to really dealing with countries that might want to go off and create a rogue path. Plus, if they fear that they're going to be targeted for invasion for whatever kind of reason, for whatever kind of geopolitical reason, it makes sense for them to brandish the weapon in a kind of a defensive mode to deter. Nobody's talking about invading North Korea, are they? Again, that would be, again, it's horrible that North Korea has those weapons, but nonetheless, we failed with our diplomacy and failed to deal with those situations. We've had some agreements. We had an arranged agreement that Jimmy Carter worked out with North Korea. The Bush administration blew that up when they came in. So we've had some efforts diplomatically to deal with these things, but Republican politicians tend not to like those international agreements and tend to blow them up. And that leaves us in the lurch.
You would advocate for a disarmament first and then negotiation with nuclear armed powers later then?
Well, I think that if the nuclear armed powers don't take their obligation under the NPT seriously and really move forward with serious negotiations for verifiable disarmament or verifiable reductions and moving toward disarmament, then it's going to be difficult to get anybody else in the world to pay any attention or do anything else. So the nuclear powers have to act first. They have to show their good faith. They have to take concrete steps. And unless they're willing to do that, nobody else is going to follow. Nobody else is going to do anything. Alan?
That was a powerful talk. Ron, with so many critical pieces of information. I don't know how you have that so clearly in your head, and it's just really wonderful and awe-inspiring. There were three moments that were really on my mind when you're done, and I wonder if you want to speak any more about any one of those three moments. One of them, we were just talking about Scott Ritter, and that right now we're reading in the newspaper all the time about this 20-year reunion, or 20-year anniversary of the Iraq invasion. And of course, Scott Ritter was appointed by Ronald Reagan he was a conservative military officer, to be in charge of the whole effort to verify and to remove any kind of weapons of mass destruction from Iraq. And he did a very thorough job. He knew that country up and down. He was saying there were no weapons of mass destruction there. They were gone. They'd taken them out. He came to our campus, in fact, and spoke over there, and you were probably there with me too, in the music hall about that. A packed audience, the largest protest in world history across the planet against that invasion. I think that's one of the moments that I'd be interested if you want to talk to me more about. Another one is you just started talking about the Democrats and the Republicans. Of course, there's been plenty of Democrats who've been on the wrong side of the war and of the nuclear weapons and of the climate issue too. But it's really been the Republican Party, above all, that has stopped negotiation, particularly on all these topics, but particularly I'm thinking about the Kyoto Protocol, and I'm thinking about also any kind of climate effort. The Paris Agreement, which was for the entire planet, was written as a voluntary agreement because of the American Republican Party. Isn't that right? Didn't the Republican Party refusal to support any kind of Senate agreements has been just devastating to any effort to address the climate crisis across the world, And the third thing that's on my mind is this invasion of Iraq. This invasion of Ukraine, and how it's raising the nuclear danger, and how it's also so tied to the climate crisis because of Russia's incredible role as one of the largest fossil fuel suppliers. Of course, America is the largest fossil fuel supplier in the world, but Russia too is, an enormous supplier, and it's the Europe is suffering, this transition and all. So, and if you want to say anything else about any of those three topics, that's to say either that I wanted to say something obviously, about the Iraq invasion or the Republican Party and its obstinacy, or what's happening now, what's going to happen with this Ukraine war, where we're going, what the risks are that it's presenting to us.
Well, I'll try to take them in order.
You don't have to do them all.
Well, with Scott Ritter, I think it was really important because here you had an established...
No one's talking about it, by the way, now.
Right. And he's had some other kinds of issues in his career and life, but on that issue, he was part of a UN that set up the monitoring and inspection system to disarm Iraq. So it was the United Nations effort. He was the American person who was in charge of the American delegation to that. But it was a UN effort. And and there were two different UN efforts that were involved there. One ended at one point during the Clinton years, and I don't want to get into all that, but then a second team was sent back in. In fact, George Bush thought that Saddam Hussein wouldn't agree to allow the UN to send back another inspection team. They thought, he'll reject that, and then we'll have a basis for invading. Well, Saddam surprised them and said, all right, send them back in. And they did. They went back in. Hans Blix and others went back in. And they were looking, they were investigating, they were producing regular reports saying we're not finding any evidence of weapons of mass destruction. Right up to the point of the invasion. They were making regular reports that they weren't finding any weapons of mass destruction, which Donald Rumsfeld continued to insist they were there. He knew where they were, he said, right? But again, the UN inspectors who were on the ground carrying out these inspections were not finding any evidence. And so Ritter was part of that larger team. So again, what it shows is that, sometimes, if people have made a decision, a political and ideological decision, that they're going to go forward with a particular military campaign, evidence doesn't matter, right? And the evidence in this case didn't matter. But we were able, as those of us who opposed the war, were able to say, look, we know. We know the experts who are on the ground are telling us there are no weapons of mass destruction. You're lying about that. You can't use that as a basis for war. It's not true, but it didn't matter. All right, what was the second one?
The Republican Party.
Yeah, obviously, both Democrats and Republicans have been imperialistic and in favor of American foreign policy decisions and nuclear weapons decisions over the years. It's not just one party. But increasingly, in recent years, the Republican Party has become an extremist party. It's the most extreme conservative political party in the world. It's the only political party in the world, conservative political party in the world, that does not believe in climate change at all. You go to any other country and you can find ideologically conservative political parties who agree that the climate crisis is real and we need to do something about it. The Republican Party has gone to this sort of extreme bender. I don't know how else to describe it. And yes, of course, if And with regard to negotiating any kind of an agreement, the reason Paris is voluntary is that Barack Obama and John Kerry, as Secretary of State, knew we can't make this a treaty. If it's a treaty, it has to be ratified by the United States Senate and approved by 2/3 of the Senate. That won't happen. That won't happen. There's not enough Republican support, any Republican support in the Senate to pass a treaty. So it has to be voluntary contributions made by countries to reduce carbon emissions. And there was, Denise, I don't know if you remember, they had a big to-do about the language. The American delegation was scrambling around to try to make them change the language because it was implying that it was legally binding, and it couldn't be legally binding because they would get stuck in this. So yeah, that meant that it weakened the treaty, the ability of American political system with its dysfunction, made sure that we couldn't have a stronger agreement in Paris in 2015, which we might have been able to have. And then Ukraine, I don't know, we're going to talk about Ukraine this Saturday. KNOW's got a book club thing going with it. Medea Benjamin, who many of you know, has written a great book about the Ukrainian situation and her analysis of it. And a part of it is to point out that the United States bears a considerable amount of responsibility for creating the situation that led to the invasion. Not that that lets Putin off the hook or doesn't make him any less a war criminal for engaging in this illegal war, but nonetheless, the U.S., by expanding NATO, remember, we promised Gorbachev that we wouldn't expand NATO 1 inch to the east. Not 1 inch to the east, we said. James Baker told Gorbachev that, not 1 inch to the east. Well, we certainly violated that. And Clinton is the one, by the way, who started that enlargement of NATO. And so that was one part of it. The 2014 revolution in Ukraine, we intervened in that and helped to botch that. And so the United States and NATO have a considerable amount of, they're involved in this.
List of those Eastern European countries that were allowed to join NATO?
Pardon?
The Eastern European countries that crossed over that 1 inch line, there are quite a few of them, right? I mean, that are in NATO now?
Yes. I mean, the enlargement of NATO, and of course it's continued to grow, and of course one of the major concerns here is that Ukraine would join, right? And that was...
now just joined.
And Finland and Sweden have just joined, and that they would have never even contemplated that had it not been for Putin's invasion, right? But again, it was a sore point. It was an issue. It was, you're poking the bear with a stick when you enlarge NATO, right? And the bear can growl back at you, and the bear did growl back in this case. And so there's a longer history there. And people, that's the problem with U.S. media. Our media never present the larger historical and social context for these events, right? And so, they give us their take, and it's always completely absent this larger context to help it make it more understandable. But yes, and I was cursing Putin after the invasion because he made me go back and rewrite part of the book, right? I'd already written the introductory chapter. Now I had to go back and rewrite a considerable section of that chapter to, hey, there's a new nuclear threat here, right? Now the doomsday clock is going to be moved forward. It was just a matter of how much, not if, right? I actually thought that the bulletin was going to move it even closer. I thought 60 seconds is where they would move it instead of just 90 seconds. But January 24th, I'm online waiting to see what the announcement's going to be, because I start the first chapter. The first chapter of the new book is 100 seconds to midnight. Well, now it's not 100 seconds, it's 90 seconds to midnight, so I had to change it, right? And in the final chapter, of course, I have to also now discuss Ukraine and what that means. We're in a situation, where the nuclear danger has escalated again, right? Putin's thinly veiled threats to use nuclear weapons make things much, much, much more dangerous, right? And we have... does the international political community have a way to deal with that and bring about true negotiations? Right now, no. Right now, we don't have a way. The U.S. and NATO are not accommodating in any sense right now to the negotiations. Whether China can step in and try to create some movement there, I don't know. But we'll just have to wait and see. But right now, we're stuck in a very bad situation where there doesn't appear to be much room to maneuver, much way to maneuver and get out of it. So Did I get all your questions?
Yeah, you got, I was hoping for one, but you did awesome.
Are there other questions? Steve?
Ron, are there any lessons learned, like, from the nuclear movement maybe is a little older than the climate movement? Is there a parallel non-proliferation option? You know, have we learned anything that can be useful going forward?
Well, I always go back to the early 1980s. And when Reagan started rattling the nuclear saber, causing all this turmoil and fear, and it brought the nuclear disarmament movement back to life. This is a movement that's been around forever, right? It started before the bombs were dropped. The atomic scientists themselves in the Manhattan Project vigorously fought against dropping the bomb. Once it was clear Hitler was not going to have the bomb, they said, that's it. We don't, you know, this should not be used against anybody. You should not use this against Japan. They all voted against it. They all lobbied against it. Leo Szilard and all of them, they fought very hard.
Einstein wrote to Frank, the president.
Well, so actually that's another important footnote there. It was Szilard who went to his good friend and mentor, Einstein, and said, look, Hitler could get hold of some uranium in Belgium, the Belgian Congo, and create a bomb. We got to do something about that. So they crafted a letter that eventually went to FDR. And based on that letter, the Manhattan Project was created. Yeah. So the whole project started to create the atomic bomb was created by Leo Szilard and Einstein, right? And then later, of course, then Szilard was like the most vociferous person to say, don't drop it against Japan. Leo Szilard is a fascinating person. If you never have read anything about Leo Szilard, I highly recommend that you look into him. I've got a lengthy section on Szilard in my book that starts off one of the chapters, but he was a fascinating figure. But he fought very hard against the use of the bomb. And so the atomic scientists themselves had a very strong movement in the beginning. That's what led to the creation of the doomsday clock. And then, of course, it expanded to World Federalists and other peace organizations. But it's ebbed and flowed, right? It gets strong and then it goes away, and then it gets strong and then it goes away. But in the early 1980s, it came back very strong. And again, we had those million people that were marching through Midtown Manhattan from the UN up to the Great Lawn in Central Park, June 12th, 1982. I always tell the story about that day. We were there, my wife and my infant son, and we're marching down Fifth Avenue, of course, the grandest street in New York City, all the big shopping streets and busy traffic. Normally, no traffic that day. So I laid my son, Andrew, down in the middle of Fifth Avenue and changed his diaper. He always tells that story. I changed his diaper in the middle of Fifth Avenue. But we were there that day, and it had an enormous effect. I mean, all the musicians were there. Bruce Springsteen and all these great musicians came out, all the great speakers. And it really had an effect. It affected Reagan. It really had an impact on Reagan. And a lot of people don't know that Ronald Reagan was really very much opposed to nuclear weapons. It didn't seem like that from the early days of his administration, but he really was. And once he got rattled by the disarmament movement, he sort of changed his tune. And in fact, he and Gorbachev met in Reykjavik in 1986. And they came this close to abolishing nuclear weapons, all of them. They actually put it out on the table. Gorbachev and Reagan, they were trying to one-up each other. Well, you do that. Well, how about if we get rid of all of them? Gorby said at one point. And Reagan was just about ready to do it, except for the goddamn Star Wars thing. Excuse my language. Star Wars. Reagan wouldn't give up the pipe dream of Star Wars, and Gorbachev was, obstinate about that had to go before he would agree to it, which he should have realized. This is a pipe dream. There's no chance for this to ever. His scientists later convinced him that can never happen. That's just unrealistic. So don't make that an obstacle to negotiations. But they came that close to abolishing all nuclear weapons in 1986. Now they still kept together. They've had great chemistry together. And despite that failure, the next year they came up with the INF Treaty, which eliminated the intermediate nuclear weapons in Europe. One of the greatest treaties that was created during that time frame. So Reagan was affected. People got the movement meant something. The movies, the Day After movie. How many remember watching The Day After if you're old enough? Reagan was affected by that. He loved movies. He was a B movie star, right? And he was affected by that movie. He was affected by the million people marching in Manhattan. So it can have an effect. And so that's what I would say, Steve. We gotta. How do we get back to creating a June 12th kind of activity that's going to put the political pressure? And it's from our perspective now, it seems hard to. How do you resurrect something like that? We almost had it 20 years ago, right? February 15th, 2003, you had 15 million people all around the world marching against the invasion of Iraq. But that didn't stop the Bush administration from carrying that out. But it was a massive, you've never had such a large anti-war demonstration prior to a war starting as you did back in 2002, 2003. But how do we get back to creating a peace movement that has that kind of power, that kind of clout, that can get out there in the street? And you need people in the street, but you also need politicians then who are willing to stand up in the halls of Congress and try to do the right thing as well. And we've been sorely lacking in those people as well, both in the Democratic Party and of course the Republican Party has just completely gone off the deep end on that issue. How can the Democrats keep voting for a defense budget of $850 billion? It's insane. It's just totally insane. It's economically irresponsible. Not only is it insane, it's economically irresponsible, but they don't have the political gumption. They don't have the will to resist. They don't want to be portrayed as weak on defense. If I don't vote for $850 billion, I'm weak on defense and I'll be targeted in the next election, right? So those are some of the, so part of the problem is, we have to have this international movement and we have to have these legal regimes strengthened. But the only way that happens is if the United States gets its act together, right? We have to be the leader. That's just the reality of the situation. If the United States doesn't lead, it's not going to happen. And the United States can't lead given our broken political system at the moment, with our two-party system, which is just tremendously broken, and the inability to fight back against the defense industry, fight back against the militaristic propaganda. We just can't do it. We're just not strong enough. And until we create a peace movement that's strong enough to do that, to counter it, we're not going to be successful.
How do you cope?
Yeah, I write books about such cheery topics, don't I? I don't know. I think it's just, I gave so at the American Society of Criminology meetings last November, there was a panel, author meets critic. We have these things in our discipline. So my book was the featured book, author meeting critics. And two of the critics, critic is kind of not the right word because they're usually friendly critics, but and one of the critics was a former doctoral student of mine, brilliant student. The main complaint that she and the other young guy on the panel had was that I was too optimistic. I used hope in the last chapter. I talk about hope and resistance, and they didn't have any hope. They thought I was crazy to even have any hope, and they criticized me for my hope, my optimism. So I don't know. I guess it comes from, I think it comes from historians like Howard Zinn, who argue that if you look at the long arc of history, there are possibilities for breakthroughs, possibilities for movement. Unexpected things can happen with political movements. And Howard Zinn was always asked the same question, how do you maintain your optimism? And he said, well, I study history. And I know that there are breakthroughs. I know that things can change, and they can change quickly and change quite dramatically if enough people become mobilized. By the way, Howard Zinn was here in Kalamazoo talking and got asked that question by one of my friends that night. And he actually said later, well, I couldn't answer that question very well that night, so I had to write a book to answer that question. So he wrote a book called You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. You look it up. And the beginning chapter in that book is the question period in Kalamazoo. And my friend Joe's question to him, launching him into that book. But Zen had hope. He had optimism. And he said, by the way, if you're pessimistic and you give up, then nothing happens anyhow, right? So the only chance you have is to be optimistic and have hope and try to do what you can do. Because it's the right thing to do. Whether you are successful or not, it's the right thing to do, so you should do it. And if you don't do it, things are going to go to hell anyhow, so might as well give it a shot, right? And the other person I like to quote here is Robert J. Lifton, who's the famous psychiatrist, historian. And what's the quote again, Denise?
Are you thinking of Scranton? Are you thinking of...
No, it was the... I'm blanking on his quote now. I should know it, but it's in my book. But something about it's always and never too late. That's what it is. It's always and never too late. It's always too late. You know, the climate crisis are already on us. Bad things are happening. It's always too late. We can't stop some of the bad things that are happening. But it's never too late to keep trying to reduce the harm, to limit the damage. And so it's always and never too late. I think that's a very important mantra to have in working on these issues. Always and never too late.
Somebody like Greta comes out of the blue.
That's right.
You know, how much she accomplished. I mean, the high school students that were on the panel with me last week,
Yeah.
I think they were children of Greta, so to speak. I mean, they were comrades with her.
And Greta has a book out, and people know the climate book that Greta just produced. It's got like 100, she got 100 different experts to all write short pieces about different aspects of the climate problem. Great, it would be great to use in class, I think, because it covers such a wide ground, and they're short articles, but they really get to the heart of the issue. So I'm going to use it in my class this fall. So.
I was thinking of being the next book for the reading group. Right?
Could be. There's a lot in there, though. I mean, like I said, over 100 authors, 100 articles in there. So. Liberty, you had a question?
I think I'd like to end that note.
Yeah? That's a good place to end.
That was a great ending.
Well,
Thanks for